language, Aramaic, that Jesus spoke, just kind of gives you chills. When you think of Jesus on the cross when he said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, meaning, my God, why did you forsake me? Why have you forsaken me? So just, I don't know, something about that. I came across it this week and gave me chills. Our New Testament reading comes from Luke, chapter 17. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. When he saw them, he said to them, Go and show yourselves to the priest. And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? Then he said to him, Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well. Whiteness. Sweet whiteness. Not the dark that you usually hear about blindness, not the blackness, but it was the whiteness that people were seeing in Jose Saramago's book called Blindness. People would be looking at the sky one minute and look down and see that they saw nothing but pure white. And this blindness eventually spread throughout the city and throughout the country and throughout the world, and this epidemic of blindness. And the people in this particular city in Brazil were herded up and put into this abandoned mental hospitals so that they could be quarantined and kept away from the others, the normal people, lest they contaminate them. And on the other side of the hospital were the people who had come in contact, the loved ones of these blind folks, just in case they too were contaminated, and should they go blind, they would be moved over to the other side. And there was a certain camaraderie that developed amongst those blind people. They all had a common illness. They went from being very different people going about their lives and seeing each other as different, seeing each other as other. But then when they had the common affliction, the same thing, they kind of bonded together and they became one. But eventually, as they went through their travails and experiences and all of the torture and the trouble that they received from the government, being treated like pariahs, like lepers, eventually they regained their sight. People would open their eyes and all of a sudden they could see again, just as quickly as they had lost their sight. No explanation, no reason. But there seemed to be no thanks to God for their healing. They all just turned and went on their ways. And they didn't stay in touch with each other. Right? The camaraderie was broken because they'd lost that thing that had bonded them, that common ailment. Now they went back to being other once again. And as I read these passages, both from Jeremiah and from Luke, I'm reminded of this idea of how we see each other as other. But yet how there are so many commonalities too. When you look at the passage in Jeremiah has finally, the people of Judah, gone into exile in Babylon, and he's telling the people, hunker down and get ready for the long haul because you're going to be here for a while. Now there were other so-called prophets in the land telling the people, oh no, this is only going to last no more than 2 years, and that Nebuchadnezzar is going to die or whatever's going to happen, the Babylonians will be conquered, and we'll be fine. Well, it actually took about 47 years before the Babylonians were defeated, and King Cyrus came and liberated the Jews and sent them back to Israel. But you have to remember what happened in this time. The Babylonians were part of a group of people that came out of what were called the Sumerians, that were established in about the year 5000 BC, and civilization started to build up in Mesopotamia. And that same group of people, knowing that people were named for their cities. It wasn't necessarily an ethnic thing. It was that there were people from Sumeria, there were people from the city called Babylon, there was people from the city called Nineveh, right? And there were the Ninevites and the Moabites and the Jebusites and all these ites that came from different cities. They weren't necessarily different ethnically. But as they formed cities over here and over here, it was hard to travel, so they formed their own religions and their own beliefs. But yet, their religions were very similar. There were barely any differences, mostly just in the names that they called these gods. But the stories were still the same. And so it was that the Jews go to Babylon, who had ascended from the Sumerians that eventually broke into the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Okay? And so here they are in Babylon. And Jeremiah is saying, God is telling us, don't see them as our enemies. Yes, they've exiled us. What's the big deal about exile? Well, two of the biggest things that were promised by God in the covenant, the land and the temple, had been lost. They had to learn a whole new way of doing things because they were in a foreign land. But Jeremiah said, don't see these people as your enemies. Act like you're going to be here for a while. Marry even Babylonian women. Have children. Get used to life here. And most of all, seek the welfare of the city to which you have been exiled. Because this is home. And these are your people. So get used to it. And it brings back that reminder that those were their people. They weren't necessarily ethnically different. Those were their people. Right? In a sense, it was a homecoming, if you think of it that way. But it wasn't just a hopeless situation. Jeremiah was trying to teach them. Unfortunately, the lectionary cuts out that last verse of that passage, where God says, for I know the plans I have for you, plans for your welfare and not to harm you. Plans for a future of hope. Right? God is telling them, it's all going to get better, but it's not going to get better until you stop seeing these folks as your enemies and you seek their welfare. Focus on your oneness. Focus on your sameness instead of your differences. And then you have this pack of lepers. 10 guys walking along and they cry out to Jesus, Master, have mercy on us and heal us. And Jesus tells them, go and see the priest, for you've been healed. And we say, what do you mean go and see the priest? What's that have to do with it? Well, lepers were excluded from society. Right? They were unclean. They weren't allowed to mingle with the rest of the normal folk. So they had to go to the priest to get a certificate, a clean bill of health that said you are no longer unclean. You are now pure. You can go back and be with society, civilization. Right? And so these 9 Jewish Hebrew lepers said, okay, cool, we're out of here. Without a word to Jesus, without a word of thanks, without any gratitude, they take off and they hightail it to the temple because like, ooh, finally, we're ready to get back into things. We want to go see our families. Our kids have missed us, our wives, right? We can finally see them. And so they go to the temple to find the priest and say, check us out. We're clean. We're healed. But see, that Samaritan didn't have that option. He wasn't a Jew. He couldn't go to the priest and get a clean bill of health. Even though he was clean physically, he was still unclean because he wasn't a Jew. So he still couldn't be seen as a normal member of civilization. And so he goes to Jesus and he prostrates himself and he says, thank you. And Jesus says, that's funny. I could have sworn there were 10 of y'all. And only one of you is coming back to say thank you. Where'd those other turkeys go? And you're not even a Jew. But you knew better. Why? Because that Samaritan was in love with the healer. Imagine this thought, right? There's a difference between being grateful to God and being in love with God. Right? And this man felt he wasn't a Jew. He didn't know the stuff by rote. He didn't know the laws and the rules and the rituals that he was supposed to do. But he knew in his heart that he had gratitude out of love for God. And for this prophet, for this embodiment of God who had healed him. And Jesus says, go, for your faith has made you well. Wait a minute, you already healed him. What do you mean he's been made well? Jesus did for him what the priests couldn't and wouldn't do. You are no longer other. You're one of the group. You're one of us. live like that. So now let's think for a minute, who is a Samaritan? When you hear this, you're going to laugh, because when we read these stories about Samaritans, it seems like there's such another breed, right? They're so far off and far removed from the Jews. No, they weren't. King David, the United Kingdom of Israel, his son, King Solomon, his son, Rehoboam, folks didn't like him. He imposed this harsh tax rules that his father Solomon had, and he refused to ease them up. So the people rebelled, and the kingdom split. In the north, you had Israel. In the south, you had Judah. In Judah was Jerusalem. In the north, those people had turned from God, Yahweh, and had adopted the Baals and the other gods of the region, those Sumerian and Babylonian, Assyrian gods, right? The other name for the northern kingdom of Israel, just to differentiate it from what used to be southern Israel and northern, was Samaria. So those people, over 200 years of time, once they got wiped out by the Assyrians in the year 721 AD, was known as Samaria. They were the same people. Those were their brothers and sisters up north, just like North and South Korea. But they called them a different name. And they saw them as something completely different because they had changed their beliefs. But really, they were ethnically, and even in terms of family, they were the same people. And so Jesus is saying, you are one of us, but we have forgotten. And it's so easy to forget, folks, because we stand in one present moment of time. We can't remember the past. We can't see into the future. All we have is right now, and we look around and we forget that empires rise and they fall. We forget that people grow apart, and then they grow back together. This was the message that Jeremiah was sharing. Seek the welfare of the city to which you have exiled, because these are your brothers and sisters, and you have forgotten them. And that's the same message that Jesus was telling the Samaritan when he says, you have been made well. Because you're no longer going to look at us and look at you and say, I'm different. I'm not good enough. I'm not one of you guys. Those days are over. So we can learn a lot from this Samaritan. The Samaritan who couldn't go to the priest because he wasn't good enough. Because he wasn't one of the group. So we think of seeking the welfare of the city to which we've been called. I say stuff like this, but I never give concrete examples. But it was perfect timing because on Thursday night we had our Just Harvest board meeting. And we split into these committees, and then they put me on the programming committee. And one of the leaders of the Genesis Project, the leader of the committee says, what do you need? Like, funding? He's like, yeah, help me out. What else? He's like, the biggest thing missing is congregants from congregations getting directly involved in the issues. Yeah, tell me more. Well, we've got issues at any given time that we're working on. Currently, we have the bond issue, right? Somebody gets arrested, they have to pay bail money to get out of jail. If they got money, they can get out of jail. If they're poor, they sit there. Doesn't have anything to do with guilt, right? You got money, you're going to sit and rot until this whole thing is done. Or if you don't have money. Right? Then you've got this issue about GEDs, where they're trying to get the General Assembly to release funds to pay for prison inmates who want to get their GED and get an education. And then you've got the solitary confinement issue, where they're trying to get it to where folks can only be in solitary confinement 5 days out of a consecutive 150 days. Because people are getting put in there and forgotten about for years and years, as we've recently heard about in the news. So there are issues that if we're passionate about them, we have an outlet to get involved. Concrete examples of where folks just like you and me are needed to be a voice for justice. A voice to say that other people are not different than us. A voice to say we remember our sameness, that we were created under one God. Doesn't matter what we look like. Doesn't matter how our beliefs have deviated over the years and how we have changed in mindset. That we are still one. And so we can learn a lot from this Samaritan, this other one, who had the foresight. The presence of mind to go to the source of all creation and all healing and say, I give you thanks and praise, for you have healed me. And for that source of all love and kindness and goodness to say, no, my friend, I have done much more than that. You are not one other who has been healed, but you're one of us. Welcome home. That is the message that we're called to give to everybody in our community, no matter where they came from, no matter whether they wear a headscarf, or they wear a yarmulke, or they wear a long dress, or they cover their heads to pray, or they have dark skin or light skin or speak a different language. No matter who they are, that is the message, because this is the city to which we have been exiled. And exile, as Jeremiah reminds us, isn't always a bad thing.